Good morning to all of you. A very warm welcome to this conversation with Bill Gates, hosted by OneWorld. My name is Frederik de Jong, and I'm your moderator for today. And I'm really glad to see so many experts on the field of development aid. And we can discuss the role and the future of development aid together. We're gathered here with policymakers, politicians, aid workers. We have some scientists, and we also do have some journalists and young professionals. I would like to introduce both of the speakers for this moment. The first one is Mrs. Reina Buys. She is a Deputy Director General for International Cooperation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Please come forward, Mrs. Buys. And of course, our main guest of today, Mr. Bill Gates, co-chair of the Bill Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome. Please have a seat, Mr. Gates. Mrs. Buys has a great track record on development aid, and she has been an ambassador, and she has been advocating for sexual and reproductive rights. Please go ahead, Mrs. Buys.
Thank you, Frederik. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And especially good morning, Mr. Bill Gates. Minister Ploemen asked me to send you her greetings. She would have loved to be here, but she's on journey. She's in the Republic of Congo, so she can't be with you. It's an honor for me to give a short kickoff of this meeting. A time of changes and challenges. And that's why this meeting is so important. For me, it's an illustration of the fundamental changes we witness in the field of international development. We see a widening of our agenda, from health and education to issues of security and fragility, and from technical assistance to global public goods related to migration and climate change. Changes in financial flows for development, and a surge of new actors, new state donors, for instance, South Korea, the Arab world, Brazil, companies, foundations, and philanthropists, both in the North and in the Global South. This poses a major and interesting challenge for us as old and traditional development organizations and for the new kids on the block. I use this term hesitantly. Clearly, we need to find new ways to work together. We need to engage and collaborate to make our development contributions more effective. Our common framework is, of course, the post-2015 development agenda, in which sustainable development goals, universality, is a fundamentally different from the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. What does it mean for the Netherlands? We have taken up this challenge for innovation. Just to mention a few examples. Our role as a co-chair, together with Mexico and Malawi, of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, which brings together all new development actors of goodwill and challenges us to step up out of our comfort zone and engage in dialogue with partners with new ideas and other ways of working. And our cooperation with new organizations, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and new donors, such as Korea. Renewed our development cooperation policy by putting the responsibility for both development cooperation and foreign trade in one hand, one minister. This combination is an opportunity as international developments and the developing countries ask for a new aid, trade, and investment agenda. We have defined 3 important aims in this policy: to eradicate extreme poverty, getting to zero in a single generation, to create sustainable, inclusive growth all over the world, and success for Dutch enterprises abroad. We encourage investment and trade activities that benefit both people and the environment. people, planet, and profit. And if aid and trade interest conflict, sustainable and inclusive growth is leading. Sometimes we see and support very innovative thinking. Yesterday we had a nice example in our ministry when Movocado presented its experiences in Mozambique. Movocado is a system through which micro-entrepreneurs in the bottom of the pyramid are engaged in social marketing, for instance of bed nets and other relevant commodities, in a system of vouchers made available through mobile telephones. Brand new, very exciting. Development is, however, not a technocratic intervention. It's about people building their own society. It's about politics. It's about the process towards a democracy where citizens and civil society have the opportunity to hold both state and private sector accountable. Our development agendas are changing and have to adjust because of issues related to globalization, inequality, new structures, and new actors. In that respect, it can't be a coincidence that after we met Thomas Piketty and Joseph Stiglitz last week, today we welcome Bill Gates. In this context, we, both private and public actors, need to get to know each other and our roles and responsibilities. And we need to be able to be clear on which things to improve. For instance, the issue of tax evasion and tax justice. The Netherlands has renewed a number of tax treaties with developing countries. Another example is the challenge to battle Ebola. By the way, also an illustration of globalization, from an African to a global problem. This battle is not only about stopping the present epidemic, but also to work on better public health systems at large. At the same time, we need to prevent the collapse of economies and societies. Also here, we see a role for international companies. For the Netherlands, sexual and reproductive health and rights is a top priority, particularly the human rights agenda translated into the right of every woman and man, for every young person, girl and boy, to sexual health, to reproductive health, to information, to choose any desired family planning method, to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. This topic, I know, is also close to Mr. Gates' heart. And in this field, the Netherlands is exploring new paths of cooperation. By focusing on prevention, vaccine development and implementation, through public-private partnerships, such as the Product Development Partnership Fund and the Dutch support to Gavi, of which we were founders, but also with the pooling of funding for innovation through initiatives at the European Developing Countries Clinical Trial Partnership. As for Gavi, the Netherlands is a strong supporter for the HPV programs in Gavi countries and see important opportunities for enhancing the offering of integrated services such as information about nutrition and sexuality. Ladies and gentlemen, I won't take much more of your time, but I've showed some of the windows through which our government looks at development in our world. I'm sure Mr. Gates will have his personal update. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a small question. You said in the beginning, we welcome new kids on the block. I say this hesitantly. Why is that?
Because I would not mean that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is so new kid on the block. That's why my hesitation.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, Mr. Gates, I don't think you need an introduction. We all know you as the founder of Microsoft, but now mostly as the co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You're trying to improve the life of the poorest people in the world, to put it simply. And you do a lot of things to achieve that goal. You're currently on a European tour. You're in a busy schedule. You're in between Germany. Yesterday you were in Italy. Tomorrow you're going to Sweden. So we're very happy to have you here. Please go ahead, Mr. Gates.
Well, good morning. I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk about some of the great things going on in global health and how our foundation engages in that, and some of the partnerships we have here with the Netherlands. The Netherlands has always been an extremely international country, very focused on trade, helping other people out, thinking about rights in a very equal framework. And that continues to this day when it's particularly important. As was said, my initial career was not in aid. In fact, during my time at Microsoft, I really didn't know much about the poorest of the world. I got to travel to Africa a little bit. I got a glimpse that, of course, life in the poor countries was quite different. But I didn't even know that much about the various diseases and development aid and what the trend lines had been. And so it was during the 1990s that my wife Melinda and I were talking about how we would take the wealth that we were lucky enough to have because of the success of Microsoft, how we would give that back. We decided that only a small portion would go to our kids. They seemed okay with that so far. But we decided that was in their interest and in the interest of society, that really it ought to overwhelmingly go back to those most in need. And so we started to study. One of the articles I saw talked about a disease called rotavirus. It was killing over 500,000 children a year. And I was stunned by that. I thought, wow, I've never heard of this disease. It's actually the largest cause of diarrhea. And at that time, there was actually a vaccine that was being given to kids in wealthy countries, including the Netherlands and the United States, but none of the kids in the poor countries were getting this vaccine. And in fact, the risk of dying of rotavirus, if you're in a wealthy country, is almost zero. And yet, these 500,000 kids in the poor countries were dying, and we weren't getting them this vaccine. So I thought, well, that's a real misallocation of resources. That's something's wrong there. And clearly, although capitalism is this unbelievable system, and for many things, it works extremely well. When it comes to inventing medicines and getting medicines to those who are poorest, the market really doesn't drive that to happen naturally. And so there's a real need for governments through their research budgets and their aid budgets and philanthropists to step up and take that injustice and perhaps partnering with pharmaceutical companies, perhaps creating new entities somehow to solve that injustice. And so it's really with that idea in mind that Melinda and I started the foundation and said, treating lives as having equal value would be our credo, and we would go after the things that children in the poor countries didn't have, or the diseases of the adults as well, and try and drive over time to health equity. And so we got going about the year 2000. About that time, we and many others participated in a process setting the Millennium Development Goals. And as was said, 2015 is kind of a magic year because that's the end of those development goals, which were a measure of progress from 1990 to 2015, even though they were written in 2000. And now we're writing a new set of goals that have been labeled the Sustainable Development Goals that go from 2015 to 2030. And so looking at what we got done with this first set and then dedicating ourselves to that second set next year will be very important for that. So to go back to that rotavirus story, we said that our foundation would find some way to get those vaccines out to every child. And so we created, with other partners, including the Netherlands, this Global Alliance for Vaccines. And the idea there was to take the delay, which is usually over 20 years, by the time a vaccine gets cheap enough that it gets to the developing world, to drive that as near to zero as possible. And also, there are diseases that are only in the poor world, like malaria, that the vaccines don't get invented at all because there's not a demand. So it's not a question of accelerating the availability. It's actually funding the creation of drugs or vaccines or whatever tools are going to get rid of these diseases that are primarily in the tropical regions where overwhelming the developing countries are. So this Global Alliance for Vaccines raised money, went to the vaccine manufacturers, and it said, we need you to make a lot more vaccines, but these are for the 74 poorest countries in the world, and so we want to buy these at your marginal cost. This will not pay back your R&D costs, which were quite gigantic. You'll have to charge much different prices in middle-income and high-income countries to get that, and this won't fund your profit either. But we want you to do the same high-quality job. We want guaranteed supply, and this is very high volume. The 135 million children born every year, over 70 million are in these countries that are poor. Starting with India is the largest, most of Africa. So if you have a vaccine, you're going to give 3 times, and if you have 100% coverage, which we don't quite, but we're moving towards that, that's over 200 million doses a year. And if you do anything wrong, if you make it wrong, that can be very damaging, either in causing some ill effect or not being protective for the disease. And the delivery is actually not trivial, because not only do you have to make it, you have to get it to these countries all the way out to their primary health care. And vaccines, most vaccines, have to stay very cold. It's called thermal stability. So there's refrigerators and refrigerated trucks and things. It's not easy to get this done, and then, of course, convince the mothers to come get those. But that's what we dedicate ourselves to, get all the vaccines out. And so it's actually fairly exciting that in this next 5-year period, which runs until 2020, Gavi will achieve the goal of getting this rotavirus vaccine to every country in the world. That is, if we have a successful fundraising January 27th, which was our fundraising conference for the next 5-year period, we'll raise enough that vaccine, the volume, the delivery, everything will get covered, and it'll get out to those kids. So it really brings us, it's very exciting for me, because it brings us full circle in terms of how we got started in this at the very beginning. Now, that's not to say that rotavirus is the only challenge, but it's one where you can see that if we bring together the best scientific skills, if we bring together government donors, if we work with the recipient countries on their delivery systems, and still a lot to be done there, we can get out and improve childhood mortality very dramatically. There's many statistics, of course, in development, and some of them are actually fairly inaccurate. Things like measuring GDP is tough. There you'd have to have error bars of about 50% for most of these countries. Measuring deaths, on the other hand, you can be very accurate. One thing about rotavirus is that even the kids who survive are not in perfect shape. That is, these diarrheal episodes are part of why, for every kid that dies, there's 3 kids who end up not developing physically or mentally in a full way. And so the physical part of that is called stunting. The mental part, we're just starting to measure and realizing what a gigantic effect that is in terms of, even if you invest in education, that these kids can't achieve their potential and have their country really become self-sustaining unless you've gone and dealt with some of these basic health issues. When we think about childhood death, when I was born, about 20% of all children died before the age of 5, back before 1960. At 1990, the base period for the Millennium Development Goals, it was down to 10%. And over half of that was because of vaccines. In particular, a guy named Jim Grant, who ran UNICEF in the 1980s and drove for this idea of universal coverage. He got us from 20% coverage up to something about 80% coverage. But between 1990 and by the time we do the figures for 2015, we'll go from 10% of the kids dying before the age of 5 down to 5%. So we will have cut it in half. The actual goal, if you read the MDGs, was to cut it by 2/3. That was overambitious, but still it's a pretty good thing that every year, even as the birth cohort has gotten slightly larger during that period, you've gotten that down now to about 6.4 million once we measured 2015. Now that took 25 years to cut it in half. This time, what we're working to get into these Sustainable Development Goals is that we'll cut it in half again, but this time in 15 years, so that we're accelerating. In fact, we've been accelerating every 5 years. We've been able to improve. Gavi is the largest single factor in that. About 1/3 of that reduction comes from these vaccine availabilities. Economic growth, nutrition programs, there's a lot of things that work towards this. Every once in a while, there's something like malaria drug resistance or Ebola outbreaks that work against us, and you actually can go backwards. So you have to be very vigilant. It's not always in that direction. If we can get to 2030 with this extra cut in two, we'll be down to 2.5% of the kids under the age of 5 dying. And that's not satisfactory. And in our countries, we're all below 1%, and a lot of that is congenital defects that are very hard to drive down even lower. But if you go back to the 1960s, that's about what the rich countries had. So we won't have health equity, but we'll be within throwing distance of having health equity, which is the dream that our foundation was founded with, and I think it'd be one of the top goals for the world, for humanity, for the Netherlands, for many, many people. Let me talk about a few other diseases before I close, because it's very interesting. When we look at childhood death, pneumonia is number one. There's another vaccine that will get to 100% coverage that it's called pneumococcus that takes care of that, again by 2020, so following a very similar path. Diarrhea is number two. Malaria is number three, and actually in Africa, which is where malaria is primarily prevalent. It is in Asia, it's even somewhat still in Latin America, but 85% of the death burden is Africa, and overwhelmingly children in Africa. That's another one where we ought to be able to make progress. In fact, the long-term goal, the 20-25-year goal, is literally to eradicate that disease. Eradications are very hard to do. It's only been done once, of course, smallpox back in 1979. The one that is the top priority for the world right now that we're very engaged in is polio. That eradication was declared in 1988. The world started. And at the time, about 400,000 kids a year were either paralyzed or killed by polio. This year, we'll record about 200 cases. So we like to say, Rotary has these posters, we're this close. Well, of course, the last part is by far the hardest part. It's not like any other 200 cases you got rid of. But things are actually looking pretty good. I had our last case in Nigeria, which has never gotten to zero. We had the last case so far on July 24th. So we've gone 4 months. With any luck, that could be the last case there. There's no guarantee of that. They literally make you wait 3 years before they certify you polio-free. And that's not the end, because if it's anywhere in the world, it can always come back, as it has. Nigeria's reinfected many countries in Africa again and again, which is why we had to intensify our effort there. The other two countries that haven't gotten to zero are in Asia, Pakistan and Afghanistan. And Nigeria is hard, and Pakistan is hard. But when you do eradications, you end up in the sort of the craziest, most difficult, disorganized countries in the world. It's a selection process by which you end up in the toughest places. And that's why you don't want to do it very often. Most of the time you just want to do disease control. But for this one, we ought to go all the way. Let me talk a tiny bit about Ebola. Ebola, of course, is broken out over 20 times, mostly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, mostly in rural areas, and it burns out fairly quickly. The transmission is, the big transmission event is when people touch the body at the funeral. because by the time you die, you're extremely infective. You also, if somebody's in your household or a medical worker taking care of you, as you get into late-stage disease, then your bodily fluids are also very infected. And this thing in the summer, was bouncing around. How big was it going to be? Were people paying attention? MSF started to say, yes, we should pay attention. It was only in August, really, that I'd say the panic button was hitting broadly that, hey, this is unique. We need to do something quite dramatic. And I'd say the world since then, including the Netherlands, the US, the UK, Cuba with a bunch of doctors, China with some medical health teams, actually has responded quite well. And these cases are still going up, but I'd be quite hopeful, and there are strong signs that these interventions, once all the things that are in the pipeline get out there, that we will be able to bring this under control. It's been tragic. It's shut down, it's not just killed people directly, it's shut down the health systems. Those health systems were very poor, and so hopefully we won't just, once we're done with this, walk away with it. Hopefully we'll commit to great health systems there, primary health care. We'll commit to a better surveillance system, and we'll commit to R&D. We need new tools. AIDS today, we have to treat people lifelong. We'd like to cure AIDS. TB, it's very hard. People have to take drugs, and if they don't do it perfectly, they get drug resistance. So we need a lot of great new tools against diseases. Ebola, actually, by next summer, we're going to have some great Ebola tools. But unfortunately, that's not the only pathogen that we're likely to run into that will have outbreaks in the next 20 years. In fact, it's extremely likely that some pathogen will come along that's far more transmissive than Ebola. The good news about Ebola is it appears, and as you go through the case data, we can't find counterexamples to this. Only when you're immobile and fairly sick are you significantly transmissive. There may be a few exceptions to that, but by and large, that's the case. And that makes it easier to bring under control than, say, a flu-like disease where just coughing on somebody. When we go through the case data, we're always looking for unrelated people who live near each other who infect each other. And with flu or measles, you see that. You see geographic clusters. With Ebola, what we're seeing is only if you go in there and do care inside that household does it transmit. And so in some ways, it's an awful tragedy, and I won't want you to misunderstand, but in terms of transmissiveness, we may have gotten lucky. One example is in Nigeria, where a case came in to a hospital, infected 20 people, and we moved a lot of polio resources down into Lagos, did the contact tracing, and so far that's been the only case. 8 of the 20 died, so it's quite tragic, but it didn't break out in big numbers, which in the slums of Lagos, if you had an infectious disease, given the quality of the healthcare system there, boy, it would be quite horrific. So we had our fingers crossed at that time. So these new development goals, I hope they're ambitious. The world is often distracted, the rich world, by what's going on with the economy. Budgets are tighter than ever. Getting aid budgets to go up, ideally to 0.7%, has been a little harder than was expected. A lot of countries committed to that, and a lot of them, including like Germany, still have that commitment. The Netherlands has always been extremely generous in aid. I think very smart about how that aid is spent. You're somewhat below 0.7% right now. I hope as your economy improves that you'll have the opportunity to go back up to 0.7%. But you really should, and a lot of you know a great deal about this, you should feel very good about both the size of the aid that you've given over time and the quality of that aid. The way you think about things, the way we think about things, we end up working a lot of programs together. And so that's why I've got an exciting day here, getting to meet with people in the government and talking about some of the new things we do. But I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. I will give you a glass of water. After the speech, you might need it. I've been watching a few TED Talks of you where you came up with all kinds of animals to convince the audience of the importance, for instance, of malaria. You brought out some mosquitoes. And in another speech, you brought some fireflies to stress the importance of change in environmental issues. So where is your animal? Up your sleeve somewhere?
Well,
you didn't bring any animals for the Dutch?
No, bringing mosquitoes in, I think Border Control might have thought twice before they approved that.
And second, I guess you're a bit mild on the Dutch now regarding Ebola, because I heard in Germany you were quite fierce on the topic, saying Europe reacted a bit slow.
Well, everybody reacted a bit slow. Probably only MSF can avoid that claim. We didn't give our big grant. We gave a small grant in early August and then a large grant in early September after Tom Frieden, who's the head of the U.S. Center for Disease Control, had gone over. And for all of us saying, okay, did we have a volunteer list ready? We didn't. Did we know whose planes would go in and how it would be done? Did we have the suits? Did we understand the cooling? It turns out we have a lot of half-finished products because the U.S. R&D process put it on a list of potential bioterrorism tools, which is actually kind of strange because it's not a good bioterrorism tool. You would not pick it because of it isn't as infectious as you would choose. But we had a lot of things that were half done, but when it came time to say, how do we get those manufactured? How do we get those things approved? We were like, we don't know. And so we have moved, in my view, as a world, about a third of the speed that we need to if some very transmissive thing comes along in the future. And so I think as we get into next spring, and hopefully the numbers are clearly coming down and we can look back, I hope we get together as a global health community and say, okay, next time, here's the volunteers list, here's the planes, here's how we're going to have emergency approvals for these manufacturing things. So, and I don't think it's that important to look back and criticize anyone.
No, it's only because I thought you did so in Germany.
No, and boy, if the press said that, I'll have to apologize to them. We were all slow.
Okay, let's get to the questions from the audience. We've made a selection because you've sent in so many questions. Thank you for that. And just to know, all the questions will be sent in to the foundation, so they will get an overview of what are the talking points here in the Netherlands. The first question will come from Zita Schellekens from Heineken.
Thanks. My question is about the role of business. A lot of people talk about creating shared value, the Michael Porter principle, where not only businesses want to make money, but they also want to profit the communities or the world or the earth. Do you believe that's the way forward, or do you think we should make a lot of money and then spend it on philanthropy? So if you would be running Microsoft today, would you do it any different? And how do you see that work in a difficult world we're now in?
Yeah, when we look at the economy as a whole, the private sector, appropriately, is by far larger than any other player. And so in terms of innovation, product quality, new approaches, that's primarily coming out of the private sector. And so anything the private sector can do, we should have them do. Then you have the government sector that's maybe a tenth the size of the private sector, and then you have the philanthropic sector that's maybe a 50th the size of the government sector. And each is good at certain things. Basic research, the governments need to fund. Now there's a question of which government should have done an Ebola vaccine. How do we as a world deal with global public goods? Philanthropy can't cover like educating everybody and these ongoing needs, but it can
Can't or can't yet?
Cannot. No.
Never.
No, it'll never be of the scale to take over basic governmental functions. It can be the thing that comes in and tries out new approaches, whether it's in education or in health or picking a risky scientist who thinks he has a new idea. Governments aren't perfect at that. So wild new ideas, like funding Norman Borlaug to do the Green Revolution that created high productive plants that saved billions of lives, that was done by the Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation. And governments they can look back and say, oh, we should have done that. But so there's a certain diversity and risk-taking that philanthropy can do. So back to private business. Private business often, its primary role is to make great products and sell those products. But they'll have an expertise that if they really want to be a great part of the world in their community, they can have special prices, they can give things away, they can have their employees volunteer. Microsoft, it's giving away software to schools and helping train teachers and kids for things. Unilever is, be very high on the list of socially responsible companies. I'm amazed at that, and they're a partner for us on a lot of our things. We work with small farmers, getting tea farmers so the smallholders are as productive as the plantations. A lot of really exciting stuff.
These are very nice examples. Do you think overall the multinationals are already doing enough?
We can push them to do more. The pharmaceuticals in particular, we do a rating every year, and GSK comes out on top, but they'll come to us and say, okay, how do we stay on top? The rest of the companies do not come out on top, and they
don't call you.
Oh no, they do.
Oh, they do.
No, it's a very positive thing because their employees are looking at their company. There were a few pharmaceutical companies who historically said, we won't make any medicines for poor people because if you make them, then these sort of non-capitalist types come along and say they should be free. And so because they didn't do medicine for poor people, they said, oh, if we ever come up with one, we'll make it free. It's those other bad guys who invented the drugs for the poor people. They're the ones who aren't giving away for free. We just don't happen to have any, but we agree with that it should be free. And so there was a perverse system where people were tougher on the ones like GSK, Sanofi, Merck, who really were doing these tough products, and then saying, hey, you're not even allowed to recover your cost. And the idea, this pricing stuff is complicated. Who are the lowest income countries? What is the break-even price? Who are the middle income countries? Who are the high income countries? And, people can see that rich countries are paying several $100s for a vaccine that through Gavi is being sold for $5 or less. And they can say, hey, what's wrong with us? Well, the answer is you're paying for our R&D. But companies as a whole, I think there is a positive trend to get more engaged, and the activism inside those companies, outside those companies has been very powerful to get that as more of an actor. In terms of individuals, building a great company is a huge contribution. If it doesn't happen to operate in poor countries or deprived people in rich countries, then you can take your wealth and give it back. And philanthropy is growing as a global thing. It's stronger, it's more of a tradition so far in the United States than in most other places.
We have another question from Jovita Gupta, professor at the University of Amsterdam.
Mr. Gates, we are very appreciative of all your work, but we have a couple of questions. The first one is...
I thought you had only one.
I have one, but it's got two parts to it. The question is essentially, should people who are very rich, apart from you, be taxed heavily so that we can collect some money for spending on global public goods by government in a democratic manner? So that's more generally about the others. And then in relation to you yourself, do you think philanthropists do a better job of addressing global public goods than perhaps governments can do?
Well, to take the second part, the government money is the fundamental money. Day in and day out, are you taking care of your citizens? Are you helping the world at large? That's the role of government. You don't, the funding things like the World Health Organization or UNICEF, you've got to count on governments to come together to do those things. Philanthropists can bring, an extra level of energy, like polio eradication. It wouldn't be as aggressively pursued, without foundation involvement. So the goals can be tuned up, they can be more ambitious. The drug discovery goals for AIDS, malaria, TB, we're the largest funder for all but HIV. There, the US government's the largest, but of all the other infectious diseases, we're the largest funder. So, that accelerates things. But the responsibility for delivery, governments have to raise enough taxes to take on that responsibility and then view philanthropy as just maybe a supercharger. In terms of tax policy, I certainly believe in progressive taxation. And there's a Thomas Piketty book that came out.
Yeah, he was here. We had the whole hype here in the Netherlands.
And I wrote on my blog, which is gatesnotes.com, the basic agreement I have with him that we should understand these issues better and that we're going to have to be more progressive over time because of health costs and various things. I was pushing more for a consumption tax. He pushes more for a wealth tax. They have pluses and minuses, but in general, that idea of progressivity is shared by those. So in large part, I agree with him. He had a few things that weren't quite right. He made it sound like the rich people from hundreds of years ago control all the wealth today. That's not true. The system is more dynamic than the picture he painted, which is good, but there will be big accumulations unless tax policy is smart about being more progressive in the future.
Paul Hoebink, professor at the Radboud University in Nijmegen.
You started nicely with praise for the Netherlands and you ended with praise for the Netherlands, but our present government, as you already also indicated, lowered our aid to 0.56 next year. And the climate in the Netherlands on development cooperation, development assistance is rather negative. And it has been fueled very much by the conservative liberals, by their former leader Frits Bolkestein, and not to forget the present Minister of Housing, who as a chief whip of the conservative liberals said that aid was a meaningless thing in our parliament. And so my question is, what would you say to these conservative liberals? You are going to meet our Prime Minister. Is aid indeed a meaningless thing? Is it not effective? What's your opinion about that?
Well, I've been, I think, quite outspoken that I wish the Netherlands had stayed at 0.7%. At the time that it was cut, I think if you go and look at, who was speaking out in the various articles, I was stunned that, my comments were among the most prominent. And I thought, hey, come on, where are the kids? Why aren't they protesting, shutting down the government? The Netherlands has such a proud tradition of giving aid that I'm afraid people almost took it for granted. You were at 0.7% basically forever, over 20 years, and no country that's ever been at 0.7%, like Norway, Sweden, and yourself, no one's ever dropped below 0.7%. So I was disappointed. Now, there was talk about dropping dramatically. That didn't happen. And now I'm saying, come on, let's all make sure people know what this aid does. Because aid in general, and your aid in particular, has a phenomenal impact. If an impact of €1 spent in Africa was only as effective as an impact of €1 spent here in this country, it'd be hard to make the case. Then it's just moving money around. But because things like vaccines or giving women access to contraception or creating women's groups or doing sanitation has like a 50 times greater impact in terms of human welfare than €1 spent domestically, then it's legitimate politically to say, are the voters, and it's a democracy, are the voters willing to make 0.7%? And you're voting on many issues, but in a sense, when you vote in these coalitions, one of the issues you're expressing a view on it, do we think of ourselves as generous givers, and do we feel good about that? And
how much time do you have with the Prime Minister to say all this?
The Prime Minister's always been good about meeting with me, and good discussions about how to have the aid be effective. But it's going to take a lot of voices to have various parties change this part of their platform, and overwhelmingly those have to be domestic voices. This is a tough issue because the aid and its benefits are very far away. And so people don't get a chance to go and see it. Also, governments, there's always this question, is a government supposed to brag about its own stuff? Well, that's like a political ad from your own government where, you don't want to waste money, you should just buy more vaccines. And so a little bit the validation that, our foundation, which is very analytical, very business-oriented, it's, our money, and we're choosing, in the case of Gavi, it's the biggest thing we've ever supported. We've given billions to that Global Fund, where Netherlands also came up with an increased contribution, which I was very worried about because, it was at a time when the aid was going down. And I was very pleased that went up. So there's an opportunity here to get the story out better, and if the economy is at all reasonable, to get back up to 0.7%.
I think we have a following question to this issue from Evelien Boonstoppel, researcher at the NCDO, that's the Center for Global Citizenship.
So you just talked about impact and the importance of effectiveness, and it's often presented as the solution in order to increase public support for foreign aid. However, as our research shows that while the majority say they care about impact, it's only a small part that actually looks for information on effects and results. So do you really think that an increased impact does have the power to increase public support for foreign aid?
Well, you have to deal with what's the image that's called up in somebody's mind when they think about aid. Historically, a lot of aid was not about improving lives. It was about friends during the Cold War, or various relationships. People weren't good at measuring it, and so I think the world is getting smarter about giving aid that has incredible impact. If you go to people and say, would you like to buy these vaccines that save lives for $1,000 per life saved, people, I think, confronted with that very specific case, hand them a picture of the kid that they're going to save, they're going to probably say yes to that. And so if it's amorphous, if they've read a few stories about corruption, unfortunately, a small amount of aid, if you go and spend money in Africa, not 100% of it will get to exactly where it should be. A well-run program will keep that down below 5%. In fact, a really well-designed program can keep below 2%. And so your impact per euro is still super high, even when you take that into account. But when people see a story, which may not be that numeric, like Global Fund had one case where a training session that they paid to have done wasn't done. And so that was corrupt. But you would have thought from the headline that the AIDS drugs weren't sent and that millions of lives weren't saved. So yeah, a guy who was supposed to run a training session stole the money, and that was 0.01% of the money. And it was, in that case, actually caught by the Global Fund, and the press chose to write about it 6 months later. So sometimes it's easy to smear aid or even vaccines and the safety of vaccines with a few small stories and the kind of numeric sense of, oh, okay, that's, nowadays we're doing better on these things and, we are responsive into looking into these things. It is very different. So if people thought aid was sort of guilt money, you're supposed to feel bad about being wealthy, and if you don't write this check, if you think about it that way, then no, it's not worth doing. This is not penance. Well, if you want it to be penance, if that's why you do it, fine, we'll take your money and we'll use it very well. But that's not my theory of how we promote it to the voters at large.
And do you ever see governments or people, private persons, withdraw as soon as they see your foundation is getting into some issue or country? They think, oh, Bill and Melinda are going to arrange it.
Well, development aid by all the rich countries is 130 billion, and we give 4 billion a year, and that's spread across a lot of things. We're very heavy into the upstream research piece. That's $1.5 billion for us. So our downstream delivery stuff for global health is about $1.5 billion, and so we are an actor, and compared to other foundations, we are a large actor, but compared to the scale of the problems and the amount of money, the government money, the government of Netherlands gives substantially more than our foundation gives. If you polled people, they might not say that, but that's the way it is. And the U.S. gives $30 billion a year. Britain gives, those in dollars, Britain gives 18 billion a year. Britain is the exemplar right now because they had massive budget deficits like nothing you've ever seen, and they were cutting everything, and they raised their aid. They had been at about 0.36 up to 0.7%, and they've maintained that commitment. And that's a right-wing government that has taken it as part of how they want Britain.
So why didn't you give this example to the Prime Minister this afternoon?
Believe me, he's heard it
no,
before.
But just,
he'll hear it again today.
The power of repetition.
It's a dialogue, but remember, aid, this is a democracy. It's not just going in and talking to that one person. The platform of that party, they didn't hide it. They had in their platform this, and I don't know what the other issues were, but they were voted in with this in this platform. Thank goodness their coalition partner had some influence on that, and so the cut, although disappointing, hasn't been gigantic. But this is not my problem.
No.
And
okay.
It's not some moral thing. They were very straightforward about it, and the situation, frankly, is slightly better than I was worried that it would be a few years ago when this first came up.
Let's get to agriculture. Joris Lohman from the Youth Food Movement has a question.
Good morning, Mr. Gates. I represent the global grassroots movement of young people that are changing the future of food and farming. And we want to live in a world where good, clean and fair food is available for everyone. In order to feed the world in the future, we need to get young people involved in farming. So my question is, what can we do to make farming as a profession more attractive to young people, both in developed countries and in less developed economies?
Yeah, farming in the poor countries is a huge deal because over 70% of the people are engaged in farming in the poor countries, and many of them are families, so-called smallholders, where they're working on 1 to 2 hectares of land. And in the extreme case, there's subsistence. That is, the crops they grow are primarily being used to feed them. And they're subject to huge variation because of the weather, productivity, pests, things like that. And they don't have much in the way of buffer stocks. So when we think of the poor of the world, our primary image should be of a farmer. And helping them get more productivity, be able to get credit so they can use fertilizer, which then they'd have an excess that they could sell in cash. Helping them out is extremely important. Our second biggest program after health is agriculture, and there are these global centers that help improve seeds, and those are the centers that did the Green Revolution. The CIMMYT in Mexico and IRRI in Philippines came up with those new productive things. There's reasons why that didn't reach Africa, Africa's particular need to do better. So, in that world, the value of labor is very low, and so you want labor-intensive farming. In the rich world, farming's really different. I mean, in Europe, you distort farming prices massively and to overpay for food. And that's, it's another one of those political things that you've chosen to do, but and the U.S. isn't innocent in that. It's less, it distorts things less than Europe does. So agriculture has always had a unique position in terms of how people think about it. We do need innovation. It is being mechanized more and more as we have computer cameras that are scanning things and GPS that's looking at the soil. The innovation in farming makes it amazing, and young people are considering it should realize it's not quite, the job is a very sophisticated job.
So you think the innovation will make it more attractive, possibly?
I hope so, and I think so. The total, as a percentage of the economy in rich countries, agriculture, even if you define it broadly with value-added processing, it's only going to be about 3 or 4%. But you need really great people in that area because we need to make about twice as much food. Population growth only goes up about 35%, but because as people get rich, they eat more meat, and that's an inefficient way of getting calories. So your grain production between now and 2050 has to double. And that's doable. If we just get Africa up in numbers, and a few other places, South America, Ukraine actually, there's a lot of upside. It is within reach because of the innovation that takes place. Now, some of those innovations are controversial, but they do lead you to be able to feed the world.
There's another aspect to agriculture, and there's a question from Kees van Rij, he's manager at AgriTerra.
Mr. Gates, my question is on cooperatives. As you may know, agriculture is in Holland one of the powerhouses of the Dutch economy, and that's mainly built on over 100 years of cooperative development, so built by farmer hands. So, but in this globalized economy with the Danones and the Nestle's and all those big multinationals, what do you think of the role could be of cooperatives in getting a bigger share of the pie and getting one more step in the value chain? So is there still a role to play for cooperatives in order to be able to compete with those multinationals?
Yeah, well, the cooperative structure, it varies a lot from rich country to rich country, but in most, it's been a very important thing, including in the United States, because there's a lot of things like storage and sorting, fattening the cattle. There are things that individual farmers, the capital investment, the specialized skills don't work. And so the idea that they band together to have those things, it's really amazing what comes out of that. Let's just take Africa, we go through and look at the agricultural systems in each country. And so we rate things like, do people have land rights? Is the land properly distributed? Do they have an extension service where they educate the farmers? What do they do about pricing? Do they distort the pricing, which unfortunately can mess things up? Do they have roads for the infrastructure? What do they do about inputs, particularly fertilizers, very important there. One of the things we look at is the strength of the agri-dealers and the cooperatives. And cooperatives in some of these countries actually are bad because they force you into a cooperative, and the cooperative is just marking up the fertilizer basically and not really helping you out. So taking that cooperative idea, which is a wonderful idea, and giving people some freedom about which cooperative they go in, so the cooperatives basically compete for membership. We've seen that work very well in a number of countries. It's fundamental because you don't want to go for big land aggregation. You don't want to go for the plantation approach. The individual ownership of the land is important, but then there's so many issues, including sitting and talking about which seeds do we plant, should we use hybrids, if we have a bad year, can we pool our savings so we still can afford fertilizer for the next year. So cooperatives are absolutely a key thing, even more than here, because the average farm size in Africa is so much smaller. I don't know your average size, but so much smaller than the US average size farm.
Mr. Gates, the sun is coming up, as you can see in my face. So that means we have only 2 minutes left for the last question from Mrs. Beatrice Stickers-Muller. She's a senior advisor of the Tuberculosis Foundation. Please keep it short.
Yes. Mr. Gates, first of all, thank you very much for the inspiration and stimulus and genuine guidance you've given to make things happen in global health. I hear your call and will rise to the challenge for the domestic voice. My question is, in your experience, what public policy instrument would be key to ensuring that the Netherlands realizes its full potential for know-how and innovation towards global health with our NGOs, academia, and private sector?
Well, the upstream R&D piece can easily get lost. And for many things, including TB and malaria, even in the long-term HIV, we need these great tools. And in some ways, that should draw people into this because time is on our side. We are going to get these great tools. And so we don't have to have a pessimistic view. Health can improve very, very rapidly. There's a few things I'm frustrated right now about, like malnutrition. We're not as smart about how to intervene on that as we should on some other things. The first 30 days of life, we have some problems that we're still not as smart about how we keep the child alive in those first, how we get the good practices out for the first 30 days. So there's all these things that I'm thinking, gosh, we need better scientists to understand these things. But that will happen. How the world comes together, who should fund those things, particular when it's a disease in poor countries. The Netherlands has done some of that. I'll be encouraging a little bit more on this R&D front. And then just the general visibility, this is the age of the internet. The distance between us and these people that we're helping out should effectively be lower. And yet, today, I wouldn't say that we've really achieved that. The people I meet who are really committed to these causes are largely people who've had the chance to go and see the real impact. Maybe a few people that they describe it to, but by and large, using the internet both to spread the word and even to use it for some of the delivery in these countries. That's another piece of innovation.
So you mean once you see it, you act more quickly?
You can't. If your neighbor was dying of malaria, you would support spending on malaria. If we sorted the world randomly, most of your neighbors would be poor people because that's the way the world still is. Not as much as it was, but then we wouldn't need to have this meeting. You'd just walk around your neighborhood and say, TB, HIV, malaria. And it'd all be about local charity. It wouldn't be this, hey, let's put it in a big pot and send it over there. And, ooh, did it really get there? What did they do with it when it got there?
So we just have to change a little bit. And that makes me coming back to that animal you got up in your sleeve, I guess, still. Could it be a chameleon? Do we need a chameleon here in the Netherlands to change a little bit?
I think we need to take the tradition that's been strong and renew it.
Renew it.
No, the Netherlands has always been amazing. I mean,
we can go back to sleep easily.
Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, these are the angels, and you need to return for full 100% status.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Gates.